There's World War Z the movie, starring Brad Pitt, and then there's the World War Z novel, authored by prolific zombie writer Max Brooks. Now, while the movie had scarier zombies, the novel definitely had a far better story. In fact, the book's actual plot takes place after the events of World War Z itself, all from the perspective of a UN journalist working for the United Nations Post-War Commission, whose job is to document the stories of survivors. Through this reporter, we are given a detailed patchwork of personal anecdotes that form a vast anthology of the zombie war. And one of the things we discover in the pages of this UN report is the existence of what is known as the Rediker Plan. The plan is named after Paul Rediker, who is, of course, the creator of this war plan. Now, Rediker is often considered by the narrative to be a logical and emotionally disinterested individual, who is also often considered to be a utilitarian. The basic premise of his plan was to establish fake safe zones as meat shields, in order to protect the real safe zones, which are housing military and government leaders. These official safe zones, known as Rediker zones, were to be placed in geologically advantageous locations, where resources were plentiful and where natural barriers helped to protect the safe zone from zombie incursions. Governments would also hand-select specialists or experts from various essential fields of study to live in these Rediker zones. Abandoned zones, or false safe havens, were established to attract non-essential survivors. These disposable survivors would, in turn, attract zombies by merely being at their location. These zones would even be resupplied to keep survivors dependent on these fake safe zones, thus ensuring that the bait would stay where it needed to be. By drawing zombies to the abandoned zones, the Rediker zones could thrive, hence allowing the government to effectively fight and win the war against the undead. So the question remains, was the Rediker plan ethical, and was it even practical? In order to assess if such a sacrifice of life was indeed ethical, one must reasonably or compellingly argue that it was reasonably necessary. In the World War Z universe, the undead are not too different from those in the Walking Dead universe. They're slow shamblers, they never fully decompose, they can only be killed via headshot, and most of all, they are attracted to noise, light, and movement. Just like their Walking Dead counterparts, they also eat other animals and can freeze. As a matter of fact, the distinct difference between the Walking Dead zombies and the World War Z shamblers is that in the Walking Dead universe, everyone turns after dying. The whole everyone is infected gimmick is not present in World War Z. Now, this information is vitally important because it allows us to understand that the abandoned zones were never necessary. You could lure the undead with large explosions, loudspeakers, large hordes of cattle, massive fires, and so forth. There are many ways to lure the undead from the established Rediker zones that do not involve human meat shields. The only time where the Rediker plan can be argued to be ethical is when all the other alternatives are rendered to be ineffective or unavailable, at which point this plan serves as a solid way to ensure that the war effort is won, thus saving more lives than are lost in the long run. But I'd personally wager that in most instances, the implementation of this plan was not necessary and, as a whole, was undeniably unethical. And despite it being considered to be a utilitarian solution, it fails to actually embody utilitarianism, which is often misunderstood by people outside of ethics and philosophy. The utilitarian aims to improve or maximize happiness, pleasure, and/or well-being, while also seeking to minimize needless pain and misery. The Rediker plan doesn't attempt to exhaust all options and, in a grand display of butchery, disregards the very thing utilitarians care about: the well-being, happiness, and/or pleasure of all people, all in the name of winning the war against the undead. Now, to be fair to Paul Rediker himself, he initially drafted this plan in a cabin prior to having detailed knowledge on how the dead operated as an enemy force. But the governments which adopted this plan often did not apply the concept of exhausting all other alternatives before resorting to human meat shields. Coincidentally, the very act of not exhausting all alternatives also shows the impracticality of this plan. It's cheaper to drop some JDAMs than it is to gather expendable survivors into a fake safe zone. It's easier to start a wildfire that attracts the undead than it is to move or attract people to these abandoned zones. Loudspeakers aren't particularly difficult to set up either. To quote Negan and the CRM, people are a resource in their own right. Now, unlike Negan and the CRM, I don't view them to be an exploitable resource. But human capital and labor is still valuable when fighting a war against the undead. In fact, it would be better to arm and train the abandoned zones and to also assist them in becoming self-sufficient. This way, they not only act as a proverbial meat shield, but they can also act as independent offensive forces that can take the fight to the undead, thus reducing the stress load on governments and militaries. Hell, they can even be turned into safe deployment zones for planned military campaigns and operations. Be that as it may, there is some real merit to the Redeker plan. Not everyone can be saved. Not every safe zone or abandoned zone can be transformed into a reliably self-sufficient community. Some communities would, without question, be meat shields. Many communities would, without a doubt, be left behind. But the distinction lies in the intent of the war planners. It's one thing to abandon groups of survivors because of a lack of resources, or because the ROI just isn't justifiable. It's another thing entirely to purposefully abandon survivors without exhausting reasonable alternatives, while then giving them just enough to stay put and to essentially use these people as meat shields. One is born from necessity, the other is born from a serious disregard for human life. While consequences matter the most in my eyes and in the eyes of many, intentions also matter a great deal. Based on what I see, the Redeker plan is the most optimal plan to save the lives of politicians and to preserve power structures. It is not the best plan for saving the lives of people, nor is it the most efficient at winning a war against the undead. And in my view, that makes the plan unquestionably unethical and deeply impractical, or rather horrendously inefficient. Anyways, that concludes this gold standard World War Z video. If you enjoy this sort of content, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Also hit that notification icon so that you may be notified when I publish a new video. Don't forget to leave me your thoughts in the comment section as well, and please consider becoming a channel member. It's pretty damn cheap and it helps me to further entertain you. With that said, I'm Captain Gold and I hope to see you in my next gold standard video.